In 1917, a fossil collector in the Illinois coal swamps uncovered something strange. The nodule of ironstone was cracked open, and inside lay a creature so bizarre that the paleontologist who first saw it could only compare it to a caterpillar. It was labeled, catalogued, and placed in a wooden drawer at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, where it gathered dust for a century. That specimen, specimen number 34567, was filed under the category of unclassified fossil insects. Generations of students walked past it. Curators used it as a teaching example of Carboniferous insect life. No one opened the drawer and asked the obvious question, what if the label is wrong? If you've ever been in a museum and wondered how many misidentified objects sit behind glass, you know the quiet tension between what a label says and what the object actually is. That tension is where this story begins. The Carboniferous period, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, was a time of giant insects and swamp forests. The oxygen levels were higher then, 35% compared to today's 21%, and that allowed dragonflies the size of eagles to rule the skies. The textbooks teach this neatly. Giant bugs, low competition, simple evolutionary ladder. But the creature in the drawer was not a caterpillar. Caterpillars are larval lepidopterans, and they did not exist during the Carboniferous. Moths and butterflies evolved with flowering plants around the Jurassic, 150 million years later. The fossil predates caterpillars by over 100 million years. That alone should have raised alarms. Yet the misidentification held for exactly 100 years until a graduate student from Harvard, a specialist in Cambrian soft-bodied fossils, opened the drawer in 2017. Her name was Dr. Joanna Wolfe, and she was looking for something completely different. She was studying the early evolution of panarthropods, the group that includes velvet worms, water bears, and arthropods. When she saw the fossil under a microscope, she stopped. What Wolfe saw was not the segmented body plan of an insect. The creature had lobopods, unjointed fleshy legs, exactly like the Cambrian lobopodians found in the Burgess Shale, dated to 508 million years ago. But this was Carboniferous, not Cambrian. The gap between those two periods is larger than the gap between the first dinosaurs and the first humans. Here's the detail that sticks. The fossil had been sitting in the drawer since 1917, catalogued under an accession number that matched a batch of insect fossils. But the rock matrix around it was Carboniferous ironstone, a type that preserves incredible fine detail. The creature's tiny claws, its body annulations, even traces of its internal gut, were all visible under magnification. Yet no one had looked closely enough. The mislabel happened because of a cognitive shortcut. The creature was small, segmented, and found in a coal deposit. Coal deposits in the Carboniferous are famous for giant insects. Therefore, it must be an insect. That logic seemed airtight, but it was wrong. The Cambrian lobopodians, animals like Hallucigenia and Aishiaia, were thought to have gone extinct by the Ordovician, around 485 million years ago. They were considered a dead-end experiment in early animal evolution, a footnote in textbooks. Finding one over 300 million years later in an entirely different environment would be like finding a living trilobite in a tide pool today. That cognitive shortcut, that assumption that a small segmented creature in coal must be an insect, hid a biological ghost for over a century. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the moments where textbook logic fails and nature reveals its hidden survivals. And in the comments, drop one word. Mislabeled. Because every fossil drawer might hold a story we haven't learned to read yet. But the specimen in the drawer was not a Cambrian fossil transported into younger rocks. It was a genuine Carboniferous lobopodian, the first ever found in non-marine sediments. That means it lived in a freshwater or terrestrial environment, while all previously known lobopodians were marine. The implications are staggering. You remember the textbook explanation of how animals moved onto land, the gradual transition from fish to tetrapods, a story centered on Tiktaalik and Acanthostega. That narrative assumes that the first land animals were vertebrates, with lobed fins that evolved into legs. But here was a creature that already had legs, lobopodian legs, walking on land or in freshwater over 300 million years ago, completely independent of the vertebrate lineage. Let that contradiction settle. The official model of terrestrialization says that vertebrates crawled out of the water in the Devonian, around 375 million years ago. But a lobopodian, a relative of modern velvet worms, was already there in the Carboniferous, over 300 million years ago. The timing is not the only problem. The habitat is. When Dr. Wolf and her colleagues published their re-identification in 2017, the paper, titled A Carboniferous Non-Marine Lobopodian, appeared in the journal Nature Communications. They named the species Inflatatica, a reference to its swollen, inflated-looking body segments. The paper made headlines, but only briefly. Most science journalism focused on the quirky story of the mislabeled fossil, not on the deeper rupture it caused in evolutionary biology. But the rupture is real. Here is what the paper actually concluded. The presence of a lobopodian in a Carboniferous non-marine deposit means that the group survived the end Cambrian extinction, persisted through the Ordovician and Silurian and Devonian, and colonized terrestrial environments long before the current fossil record suggests. That survival implies a ghost lineage, a line of descent with no fossil record, spanning over 200 million years. Ghost lineages are not unknown in paleontology, but a 200 million year gap is extreme. To put that in perspective, that gap is longer than the entire history of mammals. It is longer than the age of dinosaurs. It means that somewhere, in rocks that have never been searched or have been destroyed by erosion, there existed generations of lobopodians that left no trace. The question becomes, why did they leave no trace? The Cambrian lobopodians are found in Lagerstätten, deposits with exceptional preservation, like the Burgess Shale in Canada or the Chengjiang Biota in China. These deposits preserve soft tissues, the very parts that normally decay. But between the Cambrian and the Carboniferous, there are almost no Lagerstätten that capture soft-bodied animals in terrestrial environments. That is not a biological absence. That is a preservation bias. The fossil record is not a history book. It is a library with 99% of the books burned, and the surviving pages are scattered across different genres. A lobopodian could have been living on land for 100 million years before the Carboniferous, and our only evidence would be the rocks that happen to preserve it. And this is where the story gets dangerous for the official model. If a lobopodian survived unnoticed for 200 million years, what else is lurking in the unsampled gaps? The living velvet worms, the onychophorans, are sometimes called living fossils because they resemble Cambrian lobopodians. But the Inflatatica discovery suggests that velvet worms are not just relicts of a Cambrian experiment. They are survivors of a continuous lineage that colonized land, diversified, and then mostly disappeared from the fossil record. Think about the arrogance of assuming that the only lobopodians were those preserved in a handful of ancient seafloors. That is like finding a single photograph of a city and concluding that the entire city was empty because no people appear in the frame. The fossil record is that photograph, and the lobopodians were the crowd standing just outside the shot. The Harvard specimen sat for a century because no one imagined that a lobopodian could exist in Carboniferous rocks. The cognitive bias was not lazy labeling. It was a failure of imagination, a direct consequence of the evolutionary narrative taught in every introductory biology course. And that narrative, the one that says lobopodians were a failed experiment of the Cambrian, is now demonstrably incomplete. If the discovery that a single misidentified fossil can upend 200 million years of assumed history unsettles you in exactly the right way, then you belong among the viewers who are building a map of what biology actually looks like, not what the textbooks say it should. Subscribe now to keep hunting for the data points that force the rewrite, because this channel only exists for those who want to see the crowd standing just outside the frame. And in the comments, drop the phrase, "failure of imagination," because that is exactly what we are here to correct, one unclassified specimen at a time. If you've ever felt that the neat story of evolution was hiding something messier, you understand why the Inflatatica paper matters. It is not just a fossil re-identification. It is a data point that contradicts the clean timeline. And data points like this are accumulating faster than the textbooks can absorb them. The creature was named Inflatatica, but informally it was called the balloon animal. Its body segments are inflated, almost comically swollen, as if it were a cartoon version of a velvet worm. That shape is not decorative. The inflation may have been an adaptation for buoyancy in water or for storing air in a terrestrial environment. Either way, it tells us that the lobopodian was not a passive relic. It was actively evolving, solving new ecological problems. Now consider this. Inflatatica was found in a coal swamp deposit, a classic Carboniferous environment. Coal swamps were low oxygen, high humidity habitats where organic matter accumulated rapidly. That rapid burial is exactly what preserved the specimen so well. But coal swamps are a very specific environment, covering perhaps 1% of the Carboniferous land surface. How many lobopodians lived in the other 99% of terrestrial habitats where preservation was poor? The answer is unknowable, but the logic is inescapable. If one lobopodian survived in one coal swamp, others survived elsewhere. And if others survived, the ghost lineage may be far less ghostly than we think. It may simply be unpreserved. The re-identification of Inflatatica rewrites the story of when and how animals first colonized land. But more quietly, it rewrites a deeper assumption: that the great evolutionary experiments of the Cambrian were over by the Ordovician. That assumption is now falsified. One fossil, sitting in a drawer for 100 years, is enough. The implications extend beyond lobopodians. If a Cambrian-grade animal persisted into the Carboniferous, what about other Cambrian groups that are presumed extinct? The anomalocaridids, the giant swimming predators of the Cambrian, are thought to have died out in the Ordovician, but their relatives, the radiodonts, may have survived longer than we know. The evidence is just harder to find. This is the part of the story that most science journalism missed. The headline was, "Fossil mislabeled as caterpillar for a century." The real headline was, "Evolutionary timeline of terrestrialization requires revision." But headlines about paradigm shifts do not sell clicks. The cognitive dissonance is easier to digest as a quirky anecdote. Remember the fossil in the drawer. That drawer is a metaphor for the entire paleontological enterprise. Museums hold millions of specimens, many collected in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when classification was based on superficial resemblance. Each drawer is a potential undo button for some cherished theory. The Inflatatica paper was published in 2017. As of 2025, no second specimen has been found. The species is known from a single holotype, the original fossil. That is not uncommon for Carboniferous invertebrates, but it is precarious. If the only evidence for a paradigm shift is a single fossil, the shift can be dismissed as an anomaly. But anomalies are how science makes progress. Take the coelacanth, a fish thought extinct for 66 million years until a living specimen was caught in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. That single catch overturned decades of orthodoxy about the timing of vertebrate evolution. The coelacanth was not a transitional fossil. It was a living fossil that showed that the deep sea hides evolutionary secrets. Inflatatica is a fossil, not a living one. But its message is the same. The timeline is wrong. And the gap between the Cambrian and the Carboniferous, a span of over 200 million years, is not empty. It is empty only in our collections. The data from Dr. Wolf's team included high-resolution CT scans of the fossil, which revealed internal structures that the naked eye could not see. The scans showed that the creature's body wall was not hollow. It was filled with sediment that had compacted around the lobopods. The inflation of the segments was not an artifact of preservation. It was original to the animal. That detail matters because it confirms that the specimen is not a crushed or distorted insect. It is a genuinely different body plan, one that matches the Cambrian lobopodians in every fundamental aspect. The classification is not ambiguous. The creature is a lobopodian, and it lived in the Carboniferous. Let the weight of that settle. The last common ancestor of insects and lobopodians lived before the Cambrian, over 550 million years ago. By the Carboniferous, these lineages had been separated for 250 million years. They were as different as a fish and a starfish. Yet they were confused for each other because of a superficial similarity in size and shape. That confusion is not an indictment of the original paleontologist. It is an indictment of a system that assumes the fossil record is complete enough to draw firm conclusions. The irony is that the mislabeled fossil disproves the assumption that made it mislabelable in the first place. If you've ever been told that the fossil record is well understood, that the major groups of animals are mapped across time, you now have a specific counterexample. The fossil that sat quietly in a museum for 100 years is proof that the map has blank spaces the size of entire geological periods. The Inflatatica discovery also raises a question about the origin of velvet worms. Modern onychophorans are terrestrial, living in leaf litter and rotting logs in the southern hemisphere. Their fossil record is sparse, with only a handful of specimens from the Carboniferous and the Cambrian. The new fossil suggests that velvet worms colonized land much earlier than previously thought, possibly in the Silurian or Devonian, and that their terrestrial ancestors are hidden in the gap. The paleontologist who first described the fossil in 1917, someone named E. H. Wilson, labeled it as a caterpillar. He had no reason to doubt himself. Caterpillars were known from the Carboniferous at the time, though later research would debunk that. Wilson was working within the best available framework. But a century later, that framework collapsed because one graduate student decided to look at an old specimen with new eyes. The same graduate student who pulled Inflatatica out of obscurity did not have a better microscope or a larger data set. They simply had the courage to question a label that had been treated as settled for 100 years. If you want to see what else is hiding in the gaps that textbooks pretend do not exist, subscribe. Because the next fossil we crack open might rewrite another chapter entirely. And while you are here, drop the name E. H. Wilson in the comments. If you know a 100-year-old assumption in your own field that deserves a second look. There is a lesson here that extends beyond paleontology. The structure of scientific knowledge is only as strong as the weakest identification at the bottom of the drawer. Every unexamined assumption, every label that was not questioned, is a potential landmine for the narrative. The Inflatatica fossil is that landmine, detonated after a century of dormancy. This is exactly how science is supposed to work, not through dramatic revolutions in well-lit laboratories, but through the quiet, patient work of one person who refuses to accept a label that was written before they were born. The fossil in the drawer did not change overnight. It changed because Dr. Joanna Wolfe had a reference point that E.H. Wilson did not. She knew the Cambrian Lobopodians intimately. She had spent years studying hallucigenia, the spiky worm that paleontologists had famously misidentified upside down for decades. She knew how easy it is to get the orientation wrong, how a single specimen can fool an entire generation. That experience gave her the eyes to see what Wilson missed. And what she saw was not a caterpillar, but a bridge across 200 million years of missing time. The Inflatatica fossil does not just rewrite the story of one animal. It rewrites the story of how we know what we know. Every museum drawer, every unexamined accession number, every filing cabinet in the basement of a natural history museum holds the potential to dismantle a consensus that someone, somewhere, declared settled. The Carboniferous Lobopodian is now a confirmed fact, published in Nature Communications, supported by CT scans and comparative morphology. The mislabel is corrected. The narrative of terrestrialization is no longer the clean vertebrate story that textbooks present. It is a messier, more interesting story, one that includes a balloon-bodied worm crawling through a coal swamp over 300 million years ago, leaving behind a single specimen that waited a century to be recognized. And that recognition changes nothing and everything. It changes nothing because the fossil has been in the drawer all along. The evidence has always been there. And it changes everything because the imagination required to see it was missing, and now it is not. The story of Inflatatica is not a story about a fossil. It is a story about the crack in the lens through which we view the deep past. The specimen number 34567 will remain in the Harvard collections, but its label has been rewritten, and the implications of that rewrite will take years to fully ripple through the textbooks. Every time a graduate student opens a drawer and decides to look closely, they are performing an act of intellectual courage. They are betting that their own eyes are worth more than a century of authority. And sometimes that bet pays off with a discovery that forces the entire field to recalibrate. That is what happened here. The balloon worm, Inflatatica, will likely remain an obscure footnote in popular science writing, a quirky anecdote for museum tours. But for those who know what it represents, it is a monument to the incompleteness of knowledge. It is a reminder that the evolutionary tree is not a fixed diagram, but a scaffold built on assumptions that can collapse with a single new piece of evidence. The next time you walk through a natural history museum, pause at a dusty display case. Look at the label. Ask yourself who wrote it, when, and whether anyone has bothered to check since. The fossil that sat quietly for 100 years is not the only one. It is simply the one that got caught.